We'll be studying in Matthew 18 tonight. We appreciate so much your presence, the fact that you're here with us this evening. We have visitors with us. We're delighted you're here, and we hope that you'll be able to come again sometime. New bulletin time, so pick up a bulletin before you leave tonight. And if I look a little bit like this at times, I am here without my regular bifocal glasses, and so I will have to use these glasses for reading purposes, but to look at you, I'll look over them, and I can see you fine back there. People are still coming in. We're studying from Matthew chapter 18, and we'll be looking especially at verses 21 through 35 tonight. But I wanted to back up just to the two verses preceding, verses 19 and 20 of Matthew 18. As you know, this chapter begins with a discussion and maybe a disagreement between some of the disciples about who would be greatest in the kingdom. And maybe after the Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John had been upon the Mount of Transfiguration with our Lord, and it could very well have been that when they began to talk about what happened and transpired there, some of the other disciples may have felt cheated or left out. We don't know exactly how this developed, but the other accounts remind us that they had been discussing this among themselves, and then came to Jesus with the question, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And that's where the little child entered, and Jesus taught them about developing childlike characteristics. They were behaving childishly, weren't they? But he did not want them to be childish, but he did want them to be childlike. And he proceeds to teach them a number of other things about what will be involved in being greatest in the kingdom, and talking about the principle of forgiveness and correcting differences and not allowing ourselves to become angry and bitter about things, and to settle those issues that we might have with others as quickly as possible. And in verse 19 he said, "Again I say unto you that if two of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." So I wanted to just mention that where he says, if two of you shall agree on earth, the word agree is an interesting word. It comes from the Greek term from which we get our word symphony. A symphony is made up of a lot of different instruments. Jerry and Mary used to go to the Nashville Symphony presentations on occasion. There's a lot of different instruments, but they all blend together harmoniously and end up with something beautiful coming out of that. Those instruments are tuned so that they can, and played so that they play in unison and they play harmoniously and so on. And that's the idea here of getting along and making sure that what is produced is melodious and as it should be. So that's an interesting an interesting point to be made on the word agree in this passage. Producing that symphonic sound. It's just amazing to see all of these great violinists and others, you know, who are playing together. One great composer once was asked what was the most difficult instrument to play in his orchestra. And he said, second fiddle. Everybody wants to be first fiddle. And he said, you have to have all of those other violins playing the melodies and so on, and inserting their bits and pieces and parts to make it beautiful. But most everybody likes to play lead, he said. So second violin. But we do need to agree. When these two are in harmony with each other, and, as Jesus said, they're in harmony with heaven. The key is to be in agreement with one another, but make sure everybody is in agreement with God. That's the important thing. And so we need to sing not our tune, but heaven's tune. I think we all can understand and appreciate that. And now, this is not talking about just any two people who agree. This is talking about faithful Christians, faithful followers of the Lord, disciples of Jesus. And he's not talking about fickle people and the whims of just anybody. You know, sometimes people have agendas and so on, and they manipulate and twist until they get their way. And that's not what the Lord is here talking about. He's talking about sincere, faithful children of God and desiring to do what is right and always in keeping with God's will. Verse 20 is usually mentioned in connection with worship, isn't it? I've used the passage myself, and I've heard other preachers do it for generations. You know, where two or three are gathered together, Jesus in our midst. So when we assemble to worship, you know, He's there with us. That's true. He is with us. When we faithfully worship Him, worship in spirit and truth, He's present. God is in our midst at that time because He is pleased with our worship, and He has promised that He will never leave us nor forsake us. And so we can say that He is with us too. But here, in the present context, the two or three were gathering together to verify the repentance or the lack thereof of an offending party. That's the major context. It's within that context that this statement is made. So we need to always try to remember that. Jesus is promising His presence in support of all efforts that are made to save a lost soul. You see, that offending brother is lost. He's committed a sin against others and against God. And so the desire is to restore him, bring him back. It's interesting that in the very first chapter of Matthew 1 verse 23, we learn that Jesus is God with us. Jump all the way to the last chapter, Matthew 28. And there you will find Jesus saying, "And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world," or as some translations have it, to the end of the age. This book of Matthew is sandwiched between those two statements. God with us, and I will be with you always. It's wonderful to study the book from that perspective and to realize that Jesus is eternal. He was in the beginning with God. He was with God. He was God. And He will continue to be with His people for the duration. Any of you have any comments on those two verses? All right, let's drop down to verse 21. Remember now what's been said in the preceding 20 verses. Beginning in verse 21, "Then came Peter to Him," Jesus, "and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times? Jesus said unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king, who would take account of his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, who owed him 10,000 talents. But forasmuch as he had not to pay, the Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife and children, and all that he had, and payment be made. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion, and loosed him, and forgave him the debt. But the same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 pence. And he laid hands on him, took him by the throat, saying, Pay me that thou owest. And his fellow servant fell down at his feet and besought him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and cast him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were very sorry, and came and told unto their Lord all that was done. Then his Lord, after that he had called him, said unto him, O thou wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt, because you desired me. Should not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? And his Lord was wroth, and delivered him to the tormentors, till he should pay all that was due unto him. Now here's the point. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if you from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses. That is a very powerful parable on forgiveness. Notice there are several questions in this chapter. And verse 21 has Peter asking the Lord a very significant one. He said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Until 7 times? Have you ever wondered what triggered that question? I've thought about it. What could have triggered that question in Peter? Andrew was his brother. Do you reckon Andrew had done something to him? Sometimes brothers don't get along too well, do they? Had they had a falling out? There's nothing to indicate that.
Wasn't it the preceding thing?
It could have been. It could be related to what we've just been reading. Who is the greatest in the kingdom? You know, that could be a major disagreement over that. And so maybe some things had been said. Sometimes we impulsively react to something that has been taught or said. Could it have been something that Jesus had said about straightening out differences with brothers? Maybe it was, don't know. Was it just a hypothetical? You know, sometimes people will say, I'm just wondering. Was it one of those just wondering questions? I don't think so. I think there was something that caused Peter to ask this question, either in connection with the preceding material that Jesus had delivered to them, or something that had actually happened. I don't think it just popped into the mind of Peter, you know, accidentally or hypothetically. Probably this ongoing problem with who would be greatest in the kingdom was in the mind here. Whatever the case, this question prompted Jesus to teach a parable that is really, really important. And that parable is very deserving of the attention that we need to give to it, and we need to reflect on it, we need to study it, and we need to apply it. The word forgive in this context, how often shall I forgive him? Till 7 times. That's very generous. The word forgive means to let go or to send away, the Greek term that's translated. To just let him go where he's no longer guilty. Send him away on good terms. But the word is here used for the cancellation of a moral debt. You know, there was a moral issue at stake here. Somebody had wronged somebody. And so what needs to be done? Well, it needs to be straightened out according to the verses or the ideas presented in the verses just preceding this. You need to correct that. You need to let it go. You need to send it away. Now, that forgiving until 7 times would be quite generous and merciful, wouldn't it? I mean, that would be quite admirable. Person forgives somebody 7 times. The Jewish rabbis that suggested to their disciples that forgiving somebody 3 times was very generous. Brother Sellers Crane quotes from a Jewish rabbi, I think it's Jose ben Judah. He was quoted in the Talmud as saying, if a man commit a transgression, the first, the second, and third time he is forgiven. The 4th time he is not forgiven. End of quote. Forgive him 3 times. Now I don't know about you, but when I read that, I thought that sounds like 3 strikes you're out. We've heard that statement a lot. Forgive him 3 times, that's adequate. But instead of complimenting Peter, the Lord sort of chastises him, maybe in a gentle way, but he speaks to him and says, I do not say to you, this is the New American Standard rendering, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Now, the number 7 in the Hebrew language and the Hebrew school of thought was one of those perfect numbers in Hebrew literature. The number 7 or any multiple of it was considered to be a complete number. And so this implies a complete amount. However many times a person may sin against you and then return and ask forgiveness, you're to forgive him. And Jesus teaches that in a very powerful way with this parable about forgiveness. Now, you heard the story, or you heard the reading of it from the King James Version just a minute ago. I think most of us are familiar with it. We've read it and studied it many times. But I want us to just run through it right quickly. The setting is that of a king and the reckoning that happened regularly between a king and his slaves or his servants. And verse 24 describes a slave who owed the king 10,000 talents. That's the New American Standard rendering. 10,000 talents. A talent was the largest measure of weight, and it would equal about 75 pounds. So, you start doing a little calculating, and that would be a sizable amount. It is believed that a talent would equal like 3,000 shekels from the Hebrew weights and measurement system. You can look at Exodus 38, verses 25 and 26, and find some information about that. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us of what metal these talents were. If they were gold, they were very, very valuable. If they were silver, the amount would still have been considerable, but not as great as if it had been gold. If the talents were copper, the value would have come down a little bit more, but still could have been a substantial amount. One writer says that if they were gold, they would have amounted to billions, not millions, but billions of dollars that this man owed. And if we put it in our language today, that might be a good word to use. He owed billions of dollars. And that would have placed him in a hopeless situation, wouldn't it? How could a man ever work long enough and live long enough to repay a debt into the billions of dollars? I told the young adult class this past Sunday morning about talking with a fellow who's moving to Wyoming. We're glad Michael made it back from out there. But this fellow is moving out there, and he was talking about how he had met already some people from the Cody, Jackson Hole area. And he said, was talking to this fella, and he said, you know, we used to have it made out here. A bunch of us millionaires moved out there, and we just, we bought some property and developed some areas and everything, and said, we really had a good thing going. And then the billionaires moved in and just pushed us out. Now, most of us can't even imagine money like that. And now, of course, they talk about the national debt, you know, trillions of dollars. And I can't comprehend that. I don't think most of us can. But, Michael, that wasn't the reason you went out there, was it? Just kidding. He went skiing. He and Seth did. But anyway, there's a lot of money involved here. So a man who would owe that kind of money, there was no way out. He couldn't live long enough, work hard enough, long enough, make enough money to ever get out of debt. It is said that the amount owed would be more than the annual total tax collected from the three major provinces are under the governorship or tetrarchs of the Palestinian area. They collected annually 900 talents, I believe is what one writer said.
This right here says it's silver, it's $52,800,000.
Okay, Barbara found a footnote in her Bible. 52 million if it was silver.
And the other down here is $44.
40, okay. We hadn't gotten to that yet, Barbara. Okay, thank you though in advance. Okay, now just think about that a moment. This amount that he owed was more than the total annual tax raised in that area of the world.
What do you suppose he had spent this money for to begin with to owe this?
Maybe he was blowing it. I don't know. He may have had a MasterCard. What do you reckon he carried in his pocket? No. Yeah. See, that's another one of those just wondering questions. We do wonder about things like this, don't we? And it does raise some issues. We think, well, what in the world is he doing? You know, but we've all known people that would just max out a credit card and then get them another credit card. I didn't even have any idea what a credit card was when I was in college. But I have thought so many times about Brother Batzel Barrett Baxter's advice. He had a course where he talked to all of us preacher students and those that were Bible majors on just the role of a preacher and things to watch out for, things to try to do, and all of that. One of the things he mentioned is, he said, boys, be careful about going in debt. He said it's easy to get into and hard to get out of. And there were already some credit cards back in the 60s, you know, is when they kindly came in to vogue and started in the late 60s and so on. You could go and open an account. And there's still, you know, those who say, would you like to open an account today? And once they get you hooked, you know, sometimes you have to do plastic surgery and cut off your credit cards. But it's easy to go in debt. We don't know what this guy had blown all this money on and how he got credit enough to be so indebted. But we do know that it happens. The word repay is found in verse 25. Some versions says pay back. You'll find that word appearing in not only verse 25, but also verse 26, 28, 29, 30, 34. That's about 6 mentions within this context about repaying. You know, when archaeologists work, we're told that they will occasionally find notes, what we used to call notes at the bank, you know, where you go in, you sign your signature saying, I will repay. A lot of those ancient notes back in this very time period would have written on the paper, I will repay. It can still be deciphered. I will repay. And their signature would be affixed to it. But because he could not repay, you notice that he, along with all of his family and all of his possessions, were to be sold. If an automobile today is repossessed, those who have financed it initially will take it and resell it for a fraction of the value of it and what's owed against it. They're trying to recover some of that debt. Can't get it all, but they can get some of it. Heard a story several years ago about a man who was called before the IRS, and he kindly thought it was a little bit funny, you know. He told the IRS man, he said, well, I'll tell you what, you can't get blood out of a turnip. The IRS man said, that's right, but I can get the turnip. You know, and there was a day of reckoning, I guess, there. Well, this man couldn't get everything this fellow owed him. The king couldn't. But he would recover some of his loss that way. But now notice verse 26. The slave fell to the ground. You know, just fell right down in front of the king. That is a position of great humility, of sorrow, penitence, and so on. And he begged for patience. Be patient with me, Lord, until I can repay this. Give me time. It would have been utterly impossible for him to have enough time. But yet he asked for all of this patience and understanding in order to repay the debt. And verse 27 says that he was so persuasive in his begging and pleading that he moved the king to compassion. How many times in the book of Matthew does Jesus have it said of him that he was compassionate? We've already read 3 of those passages, chapter 9, verse 36, 14:14, 15:32, and another one will be found in chapter 20. Jesus was a compassionate person. The master was so moved by the begging and pleading of this servant that the record says that he released him and forgave him the debt. Now you think about being forgiven of a debt of that magnitude. You think that wouldn't be a burden off your shoulders? Some of you have heard me tell before about Dr. Freeman that practiced medicine in Granville. I believe the bridge up there is named after him. He would come over into the edge of course, the Smith County and Jackson County, Putnam County. He was right there, close proximity to all of them. But it is said that in his books, when he died, they found in his journal or his where he kept a record of what people owed him. He had written out from each name, paid in full. Paid in full. He forgave them all their debts. Now, this would have been a great act of grace, wouldn't it? Mercy. That's what Jesus has been talking about. And here is the man who had been a recipient of that. But verse 28 says that this forgiven slave went out and found a fellow slave that owed him but 100 denarii. The denarius was a coin, a silver coin, maybe somewhat like our nickels, dimes, quarters. Don't see any half dollars anymore. I got one in change not too long ago, and I kept it because I'd been on it so long since I'd seen a half dollar. But those silver coins would be given for a day's work. A day of manual labor would earn you 1 denarii. And so if he had 100, that would be about 4 months' wages for manual labor. So that was quite a bit, but that wouldn't even be a drop in the bucket to what he himself had owed his master. Look at the difference. Billions contrasted with just a paltry sum. Well, you read the story with me hopefully earlier. The poor fellow that he has grabbed by the throat as if to squeeze the money out of him, begins to beg for his life. He asks for the same patience, the same opportunity to pay as this very man who has hold of him had begged for before the king. But to no avail. There was no compassion, no mercy, no grace forthcoming. And the likelihood of repayment here was much higher than it was in the former case. Could have been that this servant could have worked enough to repay that within a relatively short period of time. He was thrown into prison, and of course in prison he would be forced to labor with little or no pay, so it would be virtually impossible for him to repay it while he was in prison. But the fellow slaves observing this, we're told they were deeply grieved. They understood an injustice when they saw it. And so they reported it. And you know the rest of the story. The servant was brought back before the king. And the king was very angered with him. And he turned the wicked servant over to the torturers. Those were probably the jailers. And they would interrogate prisoners to find other sources of money that they might have hidden. And that would be confiscated from them. The king was angry for one simple reason. A man who had been forgiven was not himself forgiving. And Jesus teaches us in no uncertain terms that if we expect to be forgiven, we must be forgiving. Heard the bell. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and we hope that you'll be back next week. I'll be away in a meeting, but I appreciate those who fill in for me when I'm gone.